In 1648, an Ottoman soldier named Mehmed walked up to the walls of Candia for the first time. He was 17 years old. His commander told him they'd be home by winter. 21 years later, when the city finally surrendered, Mehmed was 38. His beard had gone grey, his knees hurt when it rained, and the son born the year he arrived to fight had grown into a man Mehmed had never met. That's not a story, that's a documented fact. The siege of Candia lasted 21 years, 3 months and 11 days. It is the longest military siege in recorded history. Men arrived as boys and left as broken veterans, if they left at all. Commanders died of old age waiting for walls to fall. Children were born, grew up and joined the same fight their fathers were still fighting. Over 100,000 Ottoman soldiers died trying to take one city. 30,000 Venetian defenders died trying to hold it. Both empires spent themselves into bankruptcy, and by the end, nobody could remember why it mattered anymore. They just kept fighting because stopping felt impossible. Before we go further, I need to ask something. If this story grabs you, if you want to see history like this reach more people, leave a like and drop a comment. It's a small thing, but it genuinely helps. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare started. Because the siege of Candia didn't begin with strategy or grand ambitions. It began with an insult. A stupid, avoidable insult that spiraled into 2 decades of death. In 1644, Christian pirates attacked an Ottoman convoy and kidnapped some very important people. The Sultan wanted revenge, but instead of attacking the pirates, he invaded an island that had nothing to do with it. That island was Crete, and its capital, Candia, would become a graveyard that consumed 3 generations. This is the story of the siege that outlived its own soldiers, the war that forgot its purpose, the fortress that refused to break, and the men who died because neither side could admit it was all for nothing. Let's start in 1645, when the Ottomans thought this would be easy. So, how does a 21-year siege start? With pirates and wounded pride. September 1644, a fleet of galleys flying the White Cross of the Knights of Malta spotted an Ottoman convoy sailing back from Egypt. The convoy was fat with cargo, silks, spices, gold, but more importantly, it carried passengers. The chief black eunuch of Sultan Ibrahim I's palace, the wet nurse to the Sultan's infant daughter, court officials, servants, all heading home to Constantinople. The knights attacked without hesitation. They were corsairs with religious justification, Christian raiders who called their piracy holy work. They captured the ships, seized the cargo, and took everyone aboard prisoner. When word reached Constantinople, Sultan Ibrahim I had a problem. Not a military problem, a humiliation problem. These weren't anonymous sailors, these were members of his household. The wet nurse had literally fed his child, and now she was sitting in a cell in Malta. While European Christians laughed at him, he needed revenge. Fast, public, devastating. But here's where the math got complicated. Malta was a fortress island run by warrior monks who'd been fighting Muslims for centuries. It had defeated a massive Ottoman siege in 1565, a defeat the empire still hadn't forgotten. Attacking Malta again meant committing huge resources with no guarantee of success, and if they failed twice, that humiliation would be worse than the kidnapping. Ibrahim's advisors offered an alternative, Crete. The island was roughly the same distance from Constantinople. It was wealthy, covered in vineyards, olive groves, grain fields. It controlled shipping lanes across the eastern Mediterranean, and critically, it was held by Venice. Venice in 1645 wasn't the power it used to be. The Republic was old, slow, distracted by wars in Italy. Its navy was still dangerous, but its army stretched thin across too many outposts. Crete had fortresses, sure, but they were undermanned and undersupplied. The logic was simple. Hit someone weaker than Malta, take something valuable, and restore the Sultan's reputation. Quick campaign, big win, everyone goes home happy. On paper, it made perfect sense. June 1645, an Ottoman fleet of 400 ships carrying 50,000 soldiers under Jeladar Yusuf Pasha landed on Crete's western coast near Chania. The Venetian garrison there had maybe 3,500 defenders. Local scouts watched the Ottoman army come ashore and sent desperate messages to the Venetian governor in Candia. They're here, thousands of them, we need help. The governor's response was confident, almost dismissive. The Ottomans had raided Crete before, they'd burn some villages, take some loot, and leave before winter made sailing dangerous. This was a tantrum, not an invasion. He was catastrophically wrong. Yusuf Pasha didn't raid, he besieged. Charnia held out for 56 days before its walls were breached and the city fell. The Ottomans didn't leave, they fortified what they'd taken and kept moving. Rethymno was next. That took 23 days, then smaller fortresses one after another. Each Venetian commander sent the same message back to Candia: send reinforcements, we can't hold. And each time, by the time help was discussed, the fortress had already fallen. By 1648, the Ottomans controlled nearly the entire island: ports, farmland, roads, everything, except one target, Candia, the capital, the last Venetian stronghold on Crete. And that's when the Ottomans made their fatal assumption. They looked at the pattern, Charnia in 56 days, Rethymno in 23, and figured Candia might take what? 3 months, maybe 6 if the defenders were stubborn. In May 1648, an Ottoman army of 70,000 men under Kosa Mehmed Pasha marched up to Candia's walls. Engineers studied the fortifications and drafted siege plans. Officers placed bets on which bastion would fall first. Soldiers wrote letters home saying they'd be back by autumn. None of them knew they were staring at 21 years of hell. But why did any of this matter? Why fight for 21 years over one city on one island? Because Crete wasn't just land, it was position. Sit down with a map of the Mediterranean and put your finger on Crete. From there you can choke trade routes between Europe, North Africa and the Middle East. Venetian warships based in Crete could wade Ottoman convoys heading to Egypt. Ottoman ships based in Crete could strangle Venice's lifeline to its eastern colonies. Whoever held Crete held a dagger pointed at the other's throat. For Venice, losing Crete meant losing relevance. The Republic had already been pushed out of mainland Greece, out of Cyprus, out of most of its old empire. Crete was the last major piece. Lose it, and Venice became just another Italian city-state with delusions of past glory. For the Ottomans, taking Crete meant eliminating the last Christian naval base in the eastern Mediterranean. It meant security for their Egyptian trade. It meant prestige. It meant proving that what they started, they finished. So when the Ottomans swept across the island between 1645 and 1648, every Venetian soldier who could still walk retreated towards Candia. Survivors from Charnia, survivors from Rethymno, scattered garrisons from a dozen smaller forts. They came with refugees, thousands of them, Greek Orthodox locals who knew what happened to civilians when the Ottomans took a city after a fight. Merchants who'd lose everything, nobles who'd lose their heads. They flooded into Candia carrying whatever they could: furniture, livestock, children, elderly relatives who couldn't walk and had to be carried. By early 1648, Candia's population had doubled, maybe tripled. The city was designed for 15,000 people. Now it held over 30,000, all crammed inside walls meant to protect a fraction of that number. The Venetian commander, Francesco Morosini the Elder, faced an impossible situation. More mouths to feed, not enough soldiers, and an Ottoman army that had just proven it could crack
fortresses open in weeks. But Morosini had one advantage the other fortresses didn't: Candia itself. This wasn't some medieval castle with a single wall and a prayer. This was a Renaissance military masterpiece designed by Michele San Michele, one of the greatest fortress architects who ever lived. 7 massive bastions jutted from the walls: San Salvatore, Martinengo, Giassus, San Andrea, Sabbionara, Vituri, Bethlehem. Each one was its own mini-fortress with independent fields of fire, underground magazines, and enough room to house hundreds of troops. The walls weren't just thick, they were 20 meters thick at the base, solid earth and stone that could absorb cannonballs like a sponge. They sloped outward, so projectiles deflected instead of penetrating, and they were layered: outer walls, inner walls, a dry moat 15 meters deep and 30 meters wide. Beyond that, a glacis, an open killing ground where attackers had nowhere to hide. Then there were the outlying forts, Rocca al Mare. On paper, Candia was a nightmare to attack, but paper doesn't account for exhaustion, hunger, and terror. Morosini gathered his officers in April 1648 and laid out the reality. They had about 3,500 professional soldiers, another 2,000 armed civilians and militia who'd never fought a real battle against an Ottoman army that would soon number 70,000. Food stores could last maybe 8 months if rationed hard. Ammunition was decent but not unlimited. Medical supplies were already running low from treating refugees who'd arrived sick or wounded. And the sea. That was the only reason they had a chance. As long as the Venetian navy controlled the waters around Crete, supply ships could run the blockade, reinforcements could arrive, ammunition could be resupplied. Candia could hold indefinitely, in theory, but the moment the Ottomans cut that lifeline, the city would starve. Morosini reported to his officers, "We hold here or we lose everything." Venice has no more fortresses to retreat to, no more islands to fall back on. This is the line. We hold it or we die on it, or we watch the Republic die with us. Not exactly inspiring, but honest. May 1648, the Ottoman army arrived, 70,000 men, hundreds of siege guns, engineers, sappers, supply trains stretching back kilometers. Koza Mehmed Pasha set up his command tent on a hill overlooking the city and gave the order his soldiers had been waiting for. Surround it, dig in, prepare the guns. The Ottomans looked at those walls and thought 3 months, maybe 6. The Venetians looked at that army and thought, can we even survive the first assault? Neither side understood what they'd just started. June 17, 1648, 3 weeks after the Ottoman army surrounded Candia, Koza Mehmed Pasha made his first big mistake. He got impatient. His engineers wanted more time. They needed to dig proper approach trenches, position the siege guns at optimal range, map out the defensive artillery placements, standard siege procedure, slow, methodical, safe. But Mehmed Pasha had just watched his army crush fortress after fortress across Crete. His janissaries were the best infantry in the world. His artillery train had over 80 heavy guns. And the walls in front of him, while impressive, were still just walls. He gave the order. Direct assault on the San Andrea bastion, no more waiting. His officers protested quietly, carefully, because you didn't argue too loudly with a pasha, but they made the point. They hadn't even bombarded the walls yet. No breaches, no weakened sections. Just send men straight at intact fortifications defended by experienced troops. Mehmed Pasha shut them down. He'd seen Venetian defenders before. They broke. Everyone broke eventually. And a quick victory here would save months of expensive siege work. The Sultan wanted results. He'd give him results. On the morning of June 18th, 12,000 Ottoman soldiers formed up for the assault, janissaries in the front ranks, elite troops in their distinctive white felt caps. Behind them, provincial infantry. Behind them, irregulars, whose job was basically to climb over the bodies if the first waves died. Inside Candia, Venetian spotters on the walls watched the formations assemble and sent runners to Morosini. His response was immediate. Every gun on the San Andrea bastion gets loaded with grapeshot. Every soldier not actively manning that section moved there as reserve. Strip the other bastions if you have to, because he knew what was coming, and he knew it was going to be bad. The Ottomans advanced in waves, standard assault doctrine on strong defences, overwhelm the defenders with numbers, get enough men to the walls that some make it over, then pour through the breach in discipline. It worked against most fortresses. It did not work at Candia. The first wave got within 200 metres before Venetian artillery opened up. Not wild, panicked firing, disciplined, timed volleys. Each gun crew had practiced for weeks. They knew the range markers. They knew the reload rhythm. The lead Ottoman ranks disintegrated. Grapeshot, dozens of metal balls packed in a single cannon charge, turned sections of the formation into red mist. Men stumbled over bodies and kept advancing, because turning back meant execution by their own officers. At 100 metres, Venetian musketeers joined in, hundreds of them lining the walls in rotating ranks. Front rank fires, kneels to reload. Second rank steps forward, fires, kneels. Third rank steps forward. Continuous fire, no gaps. The Ottomans reached the moat. That's when they discovered the first of many problems. The moat was 15 metres deep and 30 metres wide. No ladders were long enough to span it from the bottom. They'd need to fill it with fascines, bundles of sticks and earth, or build bridges under fire. They tried. Men jumped into the moat carrying wood bundles and sacks of dirt. Venetian soldiers on the walls above threw grenades, clay pots filled with gunpowder and metal fragments. The explosions in the confined space of the moat were devastating. Some Ottomans made it to the wall itself. They planted ladders and started climbing. And that's when they discovered the second problem. The walls weren't vertical. They sloped outward. Ladders couldn't sit flush. Climbers had to lean backward to ascend, making them easy targets. Venetian defenders pushed ladders away with long poles, poured boiling water, dropped stones. One chronicle describes a Venetian soldier who grabbed an Ottoman fighter halfway up a ladder, pulled him over the wall, and threw him back into the moat, then went back for another. The assault lasted 3 hours. Then the Ottoman trumpet sounded retreat. Mehmed Pasha's officers counted the losses. 1,800 dead, at least another 1,000 wounded, badly enough to be out of action for weeks. Some sources say the number was higher, but even the conservative count was catastrophic. Venetian losses, 1,104 dead, maybe 200 wounded. That ratio was the moment everything changed. Mehmed Pasha understood immediately. You can't take this fortress by charging at it. The defences were too layered, too well designed, too competently manned. Every advantage of Ottoman numbers disappeared when funneled into kill zones. He called his engineers back. Forget quick victory. This was going to be a real siege. By the end of June 1648, Ottoman work parties were digging the first approach trenches. These weren't simple ditches.
They were zigzagging tunnels advancing towards the walls at angles to minimize exposure to Venetian artillery. Sappers worked at night, moving earth in wicker baskets, building protective berms, inching closer. Inside Candia, Morosini knew the clock had started. The failed assault bought time, but now came the grinding part. Trenches meant siege guns would get closer. Siege guns meant walls would start breaking. Broken walls meant infantry.
Assaults would eventually succeed. His officers wanted to celebrate the victory. They'd crushed an elite Ottoman assault with minimal losses, proof that Candia could hold. Morosini didn't celebrate. He called a meeting of all senior commanders and laid out the new reality. That was the easy part, he said. They tested us with a quick assault. We won. Now they'll do this the hard way, and the hard way works. They'll dig for months. They'll bring their guns forward. They'll pound these walls until sections collapse, and then they'll come again, and this time they won't be climbing ladders in a moat. They'll be walking up ramps made of our own rubble. He told them to prepare for a long siege, ration food more strictly, stockpile ammunition, rotate troops to prevent exhaustion, and most importantly, start reinforcing the walls from the inside, because when the Ottomans made breaches, they needed secondary defences ready. One of the younger officers, a Venetian nobleman in his first campaign, asked the question everyone was thinking: how long can we hold? Morosini gave him a look that veterans in the room would later describe as haunted. As long as the ships keep coming, he said. The moment the sea is cut off, we're dead. Until then, we hold every metre of these walls like our lives depend on it, because they do. By July, both armies had settled into their new reality. The Ottomans dug, the Venetians watched them dig, and occasionally sent raiding parties at night to destroy the work. The Ottomans dug again. Progress was measured in metres per week. Soldiers on both sides started writing different letters home. The early letters were confident, even excited. War as adventure, glory waiting just ahead. The new letters were shorter, less detailed. Many just said, "I'm alive, send money, I don't know when I'm coming back." A janissary named Hassan, whose letters survived in Ottoman archives, wrote to his brother in August 1648, "We are digging trenches towards walls that do not fall. Every night men die in these ditches, every morning we dig further. The city sits on the hill and watches us like an animal that cannot be killed. I think we will be here a long time." He was right. He'd be there for 8 more years. The siege would kill him in 1656 during a mine explosion. But in June 1648, neither side understood the math yet. The Ottomans thought, this will just take longer than expected. The Venetians thought, we can hold until reinforcements arrive. Both were wrong. This wasn't a siege that would end with reinforcements or patience. This was a siege that would only end when one side had nothing left. So, what does it actually look like when 30,000 people realize they're locked in a city that might not open for years? The first few months, people treated it like a temporary crisis. Refugees who'd fled from other parts of Crete set up in churches, empty warehouses, courtyards, anywhere with a roof. They kept their belongings packed, ready to move back home once this was over. Women still went to market, children still played in the streets, merchants still haggled over prices. But by autumn 1648, reality set in. The Ottomans weren't leaving, the siege lines were permanent, and every day the Ottoman trenches crept closer to the walls. Morosini implemented strict rationing in October. Every household got registered, grain stores were centralized under military guard, daily rations, 1 pound of bread per adult, half that for children, meat once a week if you were lucky, wine watered down to make it stretch. People started getting creative. Gardens appeared on every patch of open ground, rooftops, courtyards, even the glacis inside the inner walls. Livestock that had been brought in during the evacuation got slaughtered carefully, strategically. Nothing was wasted. Bones got boiled for broth, hides got turned into makeshift armor or shoe leather. The harbour became the city's lifeline, and everyone knew it. Venetian supply ships ran the Ottoman blockade at night. Small, fast galleys loaded with ammunition, flour, salted fish, medicine. Sometimes they made it through. Sometimes Ottoman patrol boats intercepted them, and there'd be a brief, vicious naval skirmish in the dark. When a supply ship made it through, word spread instantly. You could feel the relief in the city like a physical thing. Rations would improve for a few weeks. Soldiers got fresh powder gun. Wounded men got bandages that weren't already soaked in someone else's blood. When ships didn't make it through for weeks at a time, you could feel that too. Tension, short tempers, fights breaking out over nothing. Morosini understood that keeping order meant keeping people busy. Idle people are scared people panic, and panic in a besieged city gets everyone killed. So he put everyone to work.
Women who'd never touched a weapon spent their days making ammunition, measuring powder gun, casting musk balls, assembling grenades. It was dangerous work. Accidents happened. A spark in the wrong place could blow up a workshop and everyone in it. But it kept hands busy and minds focused. Children too young to fight ran messages between bastions. The city's streets were a maze. Adults who weren't from Candia got lost. Local kids knew every alley, every shortcut. They became the communication network. A captain at Martinengo Bastion needed to send a report to Morosini. Hand it to a 10-year-old who could cross the city in minutes. The elderly did what they could, cooking for soldiers, mending clothes, tending gardens. In siege cities there's no such thing as useless. Everyone contributes, or everyone starves. And then there were the soldiers. Candia's garrison was a mixed group. About 1,500 to 2,000 were professional Venetian troops, career soldiers who knew how to hold a line and follow orders. Another 1,500 were Greek locals defending their home island. They fought harder than anyone because they had the most to lose. Several hundred were Italian mercenaries, mostly from Naples and Genoa, who'd signed contracts with Venice and now found themselves trapped in those contracts. And then there were the volunteers, knights from Malta showing up for a few months to fight Muslims and earn glory, French noblemen looking for combat experience, German professionals hired as artillery specialists, papal troops sent by Rome to defend Christendom. They rotated in and out when ships could get through. The professionals and locals got assigned to specific bastions. Martinengo in the northwest became the primary flashpoint. The Ottomans wanted it because taking it would cut off the city's water supply from inland sources. So Martinengo got the best troops and the most reinforcements. Jesus Bastion in the south faced the heaviest artillery bombardment. The crew stationed there dealt with constant shelling. They learned to sleep through cannon fire, or at least pretend to. Soldiers developed a dark sense of humour about it. There's an account of Venetian gunners taking bets on where the next Ottoman cannonball would hit. Winner got an extra ration as mine. Life inside the walls developed its own rhythm. Morning, repair damage from the previous day's bombardment. Afternoon, artillery duels. Evening, Ottoman work parties advancing their trenches under cover of darkness. Venetian raiding parties trying to stop them. At night, Candia went nearly dark. No fires, no torches near the walls. Anything that silhouetted defenders made them targets. People learned to navigate by memory. Soldiers on watch learned to identify threats by sound. The scrape of shovels digging. The creak of a cannon carriage being repositioned. The whispered orders of an Ottoman patrol. Morosini walked the walls every night. Not inspecting, just present. Soldiers saw him and knew command was awake, alert, watching. It mattered more than any speech. By the end of 1648, 8 months into the siege, nobody talked about going home anymore. The Ottomans
settled into permanent camps. The trenches now reached within 300 meters of the walls in some places. Supply ships came less frequently as winter storms made sailing dangerous. A Venetian officer named Antonio Barbaro wrote in his journal in December 1648, "We have stopped counting days. There are only two types now, days when they attack and days when they prepare to attack. Both feel the same." He was right, and 1648 was just the beginning. The real war was about to move underground. The Ottomans stopped attacking the walls and started attacking the ground beneath them. They'd learned their lesson from the June 1648 assault. Frontal attacks got you killed, but if you could collapse the walls from underneath, you could create breaches without losing thousands of men in suicidal charges. So they started digging mines, not trenches, tunnels, actual underground passages extending from their siege lines toward the Venetian bastions. Sappers, specialized diggers, would tunnel for weeks, sometimes months, creating a chamber directly under a section of wall. Then they'd pack that chamber with barrels of gunpowder, light a fuse, and run. The explosion would blow the foundations apart, and the wall above would collapse into a crater. Then infantry would charge through the gap before the defenders could react. That was the theory. The Venetians knew this tactic. Every fortress defender in Europe knew about mine warfare, so they dug their own tunnels, countermines, trying to intercept the Ottoman sappers before they reached the walls. What resulted was a second war happening underground. Miners from both sides digging in the dark, listening for enemy digging sounds, hoping to break into enemy tunnels before the enemy broke into theirs. When they met underground, the fighting was intimate and brutal. Tunnels were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, no room for swords or pikes, just knives and hands. Fights by candlelight in spaces that smelled of sweat, earth and fear, no quarter given. The losing side got buried alive when the winners collapsed the tunnel. The Venetians were good at this. Many of their countermine specialists were miners from northern Italy who'd spent their lives underground. They could hear Ottoman digging through meters of earth, but the Ottomans had numbers. For every tunnel the Venetians intercepted, 2 more kept advancing. June 17, 1649, the Ottomans detonated their first major mine under Martinengo Bastion's outer ravelin, a smaller defensive structure protecting the main wall. The explosion was massive. Witnesses said the ground shook across the entire city. Earth and stone and pieces of men launched 300 meters into the air. The blast killed 80 Venetian defenders instantly and opened a crater 40 meters wide.
Ottoman janissaries were positioned in waiting. They charged the moment the dust began to settle. Over 3,000 men pouring toward the breach, war cries echoing off the walls. Captain Lorenzo Marcello commanded the Martinengo sector. He had been asleep in the bastion when the mine exploded. The blast threw him from his bed. He grabbed his sword, didn't bother with armor, and ran to the breach. What he found was chaos. The explosion had destroyed the ravelin and created a ramp of rubble leading straight toward the main wall. Surviving defenders were scattered, disoriented, bleeding from ruptured eardrums. And the Ottomans were already climbing over the rubble. Marcello did the only thing that made sense. He charged into the breach and started killing people. The Venetian accounts say he held that position for 18 hours, not alone. Reinforcements arrived within the first hour, but he never left. He anchored the defense. When Ottoman soldiers made it to the top of the rubble ramp, they found Marcello and 200 men fighting like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The Ottomans kept coming in waves, fresh troops replacing exhausted ones. The Venetians didn't have that luxury. Same men, no relief, fighting until their arms stopped working. By nightfall, the Ottomans pulled back. They had lost 2,400 men. The Venetians had held, barely. Marcello collapsed the moment the last Ottoman retreated. Exhaustion, dehydration, multiple wounds. He survived, but he was done. They evacuated him from Martinengo the next day. He had bought the city time, but the cost was written on his body. And here's the thing. That mine explosion at Martinengo, it was the first of dozens. That pattern, mine, explosion, assault, counterattack, Ottoman withdrawal, became the rhythm of the siege. Over and over and over, the ground around Martinengo turned into a moonscape. Overlapping craters, shattered stone, bodies buried in collapsed tunnels that nobody could recover. By 1653, the earth there had been blown up and refilled so many times that bones from 1649 were surfacing again in 1653 explosions. Both sides kept fighting over the same 100 meters of ground for years. But the siege wasn't just happening at the walls, it was happening at sea. July 1651, the Ottomans decided to cut Candia supply line. If they couldn't take the city by force, they'd starve it out. An Ottoman fleet under Kenan Pasha moved to blockade the harbour. The Venetian navy intercepted them off the island of Paros. 30 Venetian galleys against 40 Ottoman ships. The Venetians were outnumbered, but they had a weapon the Ottomans weren't expecting. Fire ships. These were old galleys packed with gunpowder, pitch and anything flammable, then set on fire and aimed at enemy ships. Essentially floating bombs guided by skeleton crews who jump off at the last second. The Venetian commander, Giacomo Riva, waited until nightfall, then sent 3 fire ships into the Ottoman formation. The first one missed, the second one got intercepted and sunk early. The third one slammed into the Ottoman flagship's stern and exploded. The fire spread to 2 nearby ships. Ottoman sailors panicked. Fire at sea is every sailor's nightmare, and the formation broke apart. Venetian galleys closed in and turned the battle into a slaughter. By morning, the Ottomans had lost 11 ships and retreated. Candia's supply lines stayed open, for now. But victories like that didn't change the fundamental math. The Ottomans could replace lost ships. They could send new armies. Venice was running out of resources and running out of time. By the end of 1653, 5 years into the siege, the numbers told the story. Ottoman casualties approximately 28,000 dead, plus uncounted thousands of wounded. Venetian casualties approximately 7,000 dead, plus wounded. Neither side had gained meaningful ground. The Ottomans held the same siege lines they had established in 1648. The Venetians held the same walls. 5 years of fighting, tens of thousands of dead. Nothing had changed strategically. Soldiers on both sides were starting to realize they were trapped in something with no exit. Ottoman reinforcements arrived from Anatolia expecting a victorious campaign and found a grinding nightmare. Venetian volunteers from Europe showed up expecting glorious combat and found exhausted men defending rubble.
A Venetian priest named Marco Buscini documented the psychological toll in his chronicle. He wrote about soldiers who stopped writing letters home, men who'd stare at nothing for hours, troops who'd flinch at loud noises even when they weren't under fire, veterans who couldn't sleep without hearing bombardment because silence felt wrong. The Ottomans experienced the same thing. Janissaries who'd fought in multiple campaigns said Candia was different. Other sieges ended. This one just kept going. Some men deserted. Most couldn't. Where would they go? The island was Ottoman-controlled, except for Candia, and getting off the island meant finding a ship. Both armies were locked in place. Both kept fighting because stopping felt impossible. Think about that for a second. Imagine being stationed at walls you can never leave, fighting an enemy that keeps coming no matter how many you kill. Years pass, friends die, replacements arrive, and they die too, and you're still there. What keeps you going? Duty? Survival? Or just the inability to imagine anything else? Drop your thoughts in the comments. By 1654,
soldiers had stopped asking when the siege would end. The question now was simpler. How do we survive another day? And then the plague arrived. But before the plague could devastate them, they had to survive what was happening underground. By 1653, the Ottomans had at least 40 active mine tunnels advancing toward Candia's walls at any given time. The Venetians were running maybe 25 countermines trying to intercept them. That's 65 separate underground battlefields, each one a claustrophobic death trap where men fought in spaces barely wide enough to crawl. The Ottomans brought in specialist sappers from across the empire, Bosnians who'd worked silver mines, Anatolian peasants who dug irrigation tunnels, even criminals offered pardons in exchange for digging toward enemy fortifications. Dangerous work, but better than execution. The Venetians relied heavily on northern Italian miners, men from the Alps who knew rock and earth like sailors knew water. They could put their ear to the tunnel wall and tell you how far away enemy digging was, what direction they were moving, and roughly how many men were working. It wasn't magic, it was experience. Here's how it worked. Ottoman sappers would dig a tunnel angled toward a bastion's foundation, moving maybe 2 to 3 meters per day through earth, slower through rock. They worked in shifts 24 hours a day. One man digging, 2 hauling earth back in baskets, others shoring up the tunnel with wooden supports to prevent collapse. Venetian counterminers would dig their own tunnels perpendicular to the likely Ottoman routes, creating an underground net. The goal, break into an Ottoman tunnel before they reached the walls. If you intercepted them, you had 2 options. Option 1, collapse their tunnel, pack yours with explosives, blow it, bury them alive, problem solved. Option 2, fight your way in and take the tunnel for yourself, kill their sappers, keep digging forward, and use their own tunnel to reach their siege lines, then blow that up. Both options required finding them first. March 1654, a Venetian countermine team led by a miner named Paolo Grimani broke into an Ottoman tunnel 40 meters from Giessa's bastion. They knew they were close because they could hear voices through the earth, but they didn't know exactly where. Grimani ordered his team to stop digging and listen. Complete silence. 5 men in a tunnel barely high enough to crouch in, holding their breath, listening. Scraping sounds directly ahead. Maybe 2 meters of earth between them. Grimani gave the signal, dig fast and quiet. They used hand tools instead of picks, slower but quieter. 30 minutes later, they broke through into the Ottoman tunnel. 3 Ottoman sappers were working, their backs to the breach. The Venetians came through fast, no shouting, just knives. The Ottomans didn't have time to react. The Venetians killed all 3, dragged the bodies back into their own tunnel, then collapsed the Ottoman tunnel behind them with a small charge. The Ottoman engineers on the surface didn't realize their tunnel team was dead until the relief shift went down and found the collapse. By then, Grimani's team had disappeared back into the Venetian tunnel network. That's how most underground encounters ended. Quick, brutal, no witnesses. But sometimes the fights lasted longer. October 1655, a Venetian countermine broke into an Ottoman tunnel that was already packed with gunpowder, ready to blow. The Venetians didn't realize it until they were already inside and saw the barrels. The Ottoman guards in the tunnel realized the same thing. One spark and everyone dies. So they fought without firearms. No guns, no grenades, swords and knives in a space where you couldn't swing properly. The Venetian leader, a sergeant named Nico Venia, later described it as the worst fight of his life, not because of the enemy, but because of the fear that someone would accidentally ignite the gunpowder while fighting next to it. The Venetians won, killed the guards, then faced a choice. Try to remove the gunpowder, or just blow the tunnel with the powder already there. They chose to blow it. Venia's team ran back to their own tunnel, lit the fuse, and sprinted. The explosion brought down both tunnels and killed 80 Ottoman sappers who had been waiting above ground to launch the assault after the mine went off. The psychological toll of underground warfare was unique. Soldiers on the walls could see what was coming. They could watch enemy formations, track artillery, anticipate assaults. Underground, you had nothing but sound and instinct. The fear wasn't just that you'd meet the enemy, it was that the earth above you would collapse and bury you alive before you ever saw them. There's a Venetian account from a sapper named Tommaso Molin, who worked countermines for 3 years. He described developing a constant tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from the vibrations of underground explosions. He said he could feel his teeth rattle when mines detonated even 200 meters away. Eventually, he couldn't eat solid food because his jaw hurt too much. He kept working until a tunnel collapsed on him in 1657. They dug him out alive, but both his legs were crushed. He spent the rest of the siege in the city, unable to walk, but the tremor in his hands never stopped. By 1656, the ground around Martinengo, Giessus and San Andrea bastions was so riddled with tunnels, active, collapsed, abandoned, that engineers worried about the entire area caving in. Both sides had to map their own tunnel networks to avoid accidentally digging into old passages that might collapse. And here's what made it worse. Soldiers above ground lived with the knowledge that beneath their feet, men were digging toward them. Every day, every night, you'd be standing watch on a bastion and feel a vibration through your boots. Was that enemy sappers or just your imagination? You'd hear a muffled thump in the distance. Collapse, explosion, enemy breakthrough. That constant low-level dread wore men down as much as combat did. The mine war claimed roughly 4,000 lives between 1650 and 1660. Deaths that don't show up in battle casualty reports because they happened underground, often without witnesses. Sappers killed in tunnel collapses, counterminers buried alive, guards suffocated when oxygen ran out in sealed passages. Francesco Morosini the Elder understood this was unsustainable. In late 1655, he wrote to Venice requesting more mining specialists and more resources for countermine operations. He was blunt. If we lose the underground war, the walls above ground will not matter. They will collapse from beneath us. Venice sent what it could, but by then, Morosini was dying, and the siege was about to get worse. Because in 1656, ships from Alexandria brought something deadlier than gunpowder into Candia's harbour. But that's
getting ahead. Before the plague devastated both armies, the siege was already killing the men in charge. August 1651. Kosa Mehmed Pasha, the Ottoman commander who'd led the initial encirclement of Candia, died in his tent. Not from a Venetian cannonball or a night raid, from fever. His doctors called it camp sickness. It was probably typhus, maybe dysentery. Doesn't matter. He was dead either way. He had commanded the siege for 3 years and gained essentially nothing. The walls were intact, the Venetians were still fighting, and he'd burned through tens of thousands of troops for a few hundred meters of approach trenches. Constantinople didn't send condolences, they sent a replacement. Musa Pasha arrived in September 1651 with fresh orders from Sultan Ibrahim. Finish this. The Sultan was tired of hearing about Candia, tired of sending reinforcements, tired of spending money on an island that should have fallen in 1648. Musa Pasha's solution was simple: attack harder. He launched a major assault on Martinengo in June 1652, 8,000 men. He'd learned from the 1648 disaster. This time he bombarded the walls for 2 weeks first, creating multiple breaches, then sent the infantry. The assault failed. Venetian defenders held the breaches. Ottoman losses, over 3,000 dead. Musa tried again in September. Different bastion, Giessus his time, same result. Another 2,500 dead. Third attempt in November, San Andrea bastion. By now the Janissaries were questioning orders. Officers had to threaten execution to get men to advance. They advanced. They died. Nothing changed. By December 1652, Musa Pasha had lost more men in 6 months than Kosa Mehmed had lost in 3 years. Constantinople recalled him in disgrace. There's no record of what happened to him after that, probably executed quietly. That's how the Ottoman system handled expensive failures. Next commander, Ghazi Hussein Pasha. He arrived in early 1653 with a different approach. Less frontal assaults, more siege warfare, mines, artillery, patience. It was working slowly. The Venetians were being ground down. Then in August 1654, Hussein made a mistake. He went to inspect the siege works at Giessus bastion personally, wanted to see the artillery positions up close, make sure the guns were properly sighted. A Venetian gunner on the Giessus bastion walls spotted movement in the Ottoman trenches. High-value target, too many officers clustered together. He adjusted his cannon's elevation, loaded and fired. Direct hit. The cannonball decapitated Hussein Pasha in front of his staff. The Venetians didn't know they'd killed the Ottoman commander until 3 days later when deserters brought the news inside Candia. They celebrated outside. The Ottoman army went into chaos. Hussein had been popular with the troops, competent, fair, and now he was dead because he'd stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Constantinople sent Kenan Pasha, then Sari Hussein Pasha, then Guru Med Pasha. The names don't matter.
They arrived, they tried, they died or failed or got recalled. Between 1648 and 1666, 11 different Ottoman commanders led the siege of Candia. The average tenure, less than 2 years. Command became a death sentence. Officers in Constantinople started trying to avoid the Crete assignment. Some claimed illness, others requested transfers to different campaigns. The joke among Ottoman military circles was, the Sultan sends you to Candia when he wants you dead, but doesn't want to execute him himself. Meanwhile, inside Candia, the Venetians had continuity. Francesco Morosini the Elder commanded from 1648 until his death in 1656, 8 years. He didn't die from enemy action. He died from exhaustion, stress, and dysentery. The siege killed him slowly instead of quickly. The Venetian Senate appointed his nephew, Francesco Morosini the Younger, as replacement. He was 32 years old. He'd been serving in Candia since 1650. He knew the fortifications. He knew the garrison. He knew the enemy. More importantly, he knew what worked. Where the Ottomans kept cycling through commanders who had to relearn everything, the Venetians had institutional knowledge. Morosini the Younger inherited strategies that had been developed and refined over 8 years. He knew which bastions needed priority reinforcement. He knew which Ottoman tactics to expect. He knew the supply situation down to the barrel. That continuity mattered. When Ottoman assaults came, Venetian responses were practiced and efficient. Everyone knew their role because they'd done it before multiple times. But even with good leadership, Morosini faced a deteriorating situation. By 1656, the garrison that had started at 3,000 professional soldiers was down to maybe 2,000 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, or so worn down they couldn't fight effectively anymore. Reinforcements arrived periodically, French volunteers, papal troops, German mercenaries, but they rarely stayed long, a few months, maybe a year. Then their contracts expired, or their money ran out, or they got killed. The core garrison was what remained, and that core was shrinking. The same was happening to the Ottomans, but they had deeper reserves. Anatolia had millions of people. Venice had maybe 150,000 citizens in total, and they were spread across Mediterranean holdings. Every soldier lost at Candia was irreplaceable. Antonio Barbaro, the Venetian officer who'd lost an eye at Gias's Bastion in 1655, took command of the Martinengo sector in 1656. He was 41 years old, but looked 60. His journal from that period is bleak. He wrote about soldiers falling asleep during bombardments, men who'd stop reacting to orders and just stare, others who'd volunteer for suicidal missions because they preferred quick death to slow grinding. He wrote, "Command is no longer about tactics. It is about convincing men that tomorrow exists. Most do not believe it, neither do I, but we pretend because the alternative is surrender, and none of us can bear that." On the Ottoman side, the revolving door of commanders destroyed morale in a different way. Troops didn't trust leadership because leadership kept dying or disappearing. Each new pasha brought new strategies, new priorities, new assault plans. Nothing stuck, nothing built on previous efforts. By 1656, soldiers on both sides had been fighting for 8 years. The 17-year-olds who'd arrived in 1648 were now 25. The 25-year-olds were now in their 30s. Men who should have been starting families, building lives, were instead watching their youth disappear into a siege with no end. And then disease arrived to finish what warfare had started. The plagued ships came in quietly. No warning, no rules for sickness, just merchant ships from Egyptian ports carrying grain, weapons, and sick rats. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. 1656 would become the year both armies almost fell apart, not from fighting, but from something they couldn't fight. The first cases appeared in late May 1656. A worker at the docks in Candia's harbour got a fever and swollen lumps in his neck and armpits. He died 3 days later. Then his wife died. Then their neighbours. By June, the doctors knew what they were dealing with. Bubonic plague, the same disease that had killed a third of Europe 300 years earlier, and it was spreading inside a city where 30,000 people were packed in a space meant for half that. Morosini ordered immediate rules to keep people apart. Infected houses were sealed, doors nailed shut, guards stood outside. The sick were moved to a temporary hospital near the walls. The dead were buried in huge holes outside the forts during short breaks in the fighting with the Ottomans at night. None of it worked. Plague doesn't care about separation when you're living in hold unclean conditions. With poor cleanliness and no understanding of how sickness spread inside Candia, people were crammed into every open space. Refugees still lived in churches, storage buildings, courtyards, many
families sharing single rooms, perfect places for rats and fleas to spread the sickness from person to person. The death toll climbed fast. June, maybe 200 dead. July, over 1,000. August, 2,500. The doctors couldn't keep up. The grave diggers couldn't keep up. Eventually, they stopped trying to bury people one by one and just dug enormous pits. A Venetian priest named Father Domenico kept records. He described carts rolling through streets at night, collectors shouting for people to bring out their dead,
bodies stacked like firewood, some still alive but too weak to complain about being thrown onto the pile. He wrote, "We have stopped treating the dying like humans. There is no time for last prayers, no time for respect. We bury them in groups of 100 and pray for their souls all together. God forgive us." The number of ordinary people who died in Candia between June 1656 and March 1657, approximately 8,000 people. That's more than a quarter of the regular people dead in 9 months. But the soldiers got hit too. Soldiers lived close together in the forts. They shared sleeping rooms, ate together, slept in turns on the same bedding. Once plague got into a fort, it tore through the soldiers. Martinengo Bastion lost 180 soldiers to plague in July alone. Jesus Bastion lost 150. The Venetian officers were badly hurt. Rich officers could afford their own rooms, but that didn't help. Plague killed rich people and poor people equally. By September 1656, Morosini had maybe 1,400 troops left who could actually fight. That's less than half the soldiers they had in January. He took soldiers from the less threatened forts and put them all together at the main defensive spots. Whole parts of the walls went almost unguarded because there was no one left to guard them. If the Ottomans had attacked during this time with all their power, they probably could have taken the city. But they couldn't because the plague wasn't only in Candia. The Ottoman camps outside the walls were even worse. Soldiers lived in tents packed close together. Cleanliness was non-existent. Toilets were overflowing, trash was piling up, rats were everywhere. When plague hit the camps in June, it spread like fire through dry grass. Ottoman soldiers didn't have the choice to separate the sick. They couldn't seal off infected tents. The army needed to keep working. They couldn't send the sick away. Where would they go? So infected men kept working, kept fighting, kept spreading the disease. The death rate in the Ottoman camps was unbelievable. Experts guess that 15,000 to 20,000 died between June 1656 and March 1657. Whole groups of soldiers stopped existing. The 12th Janissary group, roughly 800 men, was left with only 90 survivors. They had to be joined with another group because they no longer had enough men to fight alone. Kenan Pasha, the Ottoman leader at the time, sent urgent requests to Constantinople for new soldiers. The Sultan sent them, fresh troops from Anatolia and the Balkans, young men who'd never seen battle shipped to Crete to replace the dead. Many of them got sick within weeks of arriving and died without ever fighting a battle. There's an Ottoman military record from August 1656 showing that a fresh group of 3,000 troops arrived from Anatolia. By October, fewer than 1,800 were still alive. The plague killed 40% of them in 2 months. Both sides tried everything they could think of. The Venetians burned juniper branches in the streets, believing the smoke would clean the air. The Ottomans killed goats and smeared blood over tent entrances to scare away bad spirits. Doctors on both sides ordered everything from draining blood to using plant-based medicines. Nothing worked, because nobody understood germ theory yet. They didn't know about tiny sickness-causing things, or how they spread. They were fighting blind against an enemy they couldn't see. Giovanni Bonifacio, the Venetian surgeon, worked 20-hour days treating plague victims. He wrote that the worst part wasn't the body problems, the fever, the swelling, the bleeding, but watching patients realize they were going to die. Young men begging for help he couldn't give, mothers asking him to save their children when he knew he couldn't. He described getting emotionally numb as a way to keep going, stop seeing patients as people, deal with them as cases, treat symptoms without feeling. Don't become attached, because attachments hurt when they die, and they all died. Bonifacio himself caught plague in September 1656. He survived. Maybe 30% of infected people did if they were otherwise healthy and got lucky, but he never fully recovered. The rest of his journals describe being very tired all the time and having joint pain that lasted years. By late 1656, fighting had basically stopped. The Ottomans weren't launching attacks. The Venetians weren't doing surprise raids. Both armies were too weak, too sick, too sad. The siege continued only in name. Guards still stood on the walls. Artillery crews still fired occasional shots to prove they were alive, but the fighting dropped to almost nothing. Some historians call this the quiet year, the time when the siege almost ended because both sides were too tired. Both sides used the break to try and get better. The Venetians received a supply ship in November with fresh troops and medical items. The Ottomans received new soldiers throughout the winter. Slowly, very slowly and painfully, both armies crawled back toward being able to fight. The plague finally ended on its own in early 1657, not because of any cure, but because it ran out of people to infect. So many people had died or become safe from the sickness that the disease couldn't spread as easily. Cases became rare instead of happening everywhere. But the hurts remained inside Candia. Whole neighborhoods stood empty, houses where everyone had died and no one moved in. The city that had held 30,000 people in 1648 now held maybe 18,000. You could walk through streets in the evening and hear nothing. No voices, no children playing, just wind through abandoned buildings. The effect on people's minds was deep. Soldiers who'd survived 8 years of fighting and then survived plague developed a sense that their fate was sealed, which documents from the time described clearly. They stopped planning for the future, stopped writing long letters home, just focused on the present moment, because that's all they could control. A Venetian soldier named Marco Tente wrote to his brother in Venice in April 1657, "I no longer fear the Ottomans. I no longer fear their guns or their mines. I fear the air I breathe, the water I drink, the man sleeping next to me who might be sick and not know it yet. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. At least when a janissary charges, you can fight him. How do you fight something you cannot see?" The Ottomans felt the same way. An officer named Ibrahim Çelebi wrote in his journal, "We have lost more men to sickness than to Venetian swords. The city defeats us not with bravery but with illness. Perhaps this is God's judgment on our wanting too much. Perhaps we were never meant to take Candia." And yet neither side gave up. Neither side talked peace. Both just kept going, because stopping would mean admitting that 8 years and tens of thousands of lives had been wasted for nothing. By mid-1657, the siege went back to its old rhythm. Ottoman ditches crept forward again. Venetian counter-tunnels hunted them. Artillery duels, occasional attacks, the same hard, tiring pattern that had defined 1649 through 1655. Except now everyone understood how easily they could be hurt. They'd seen what could happen when disease struck. They knew another outbreak could come at any time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. That knowledge changed how men fought. They took fewer risks. Why volunteer for a dangerous raid when disease might kill you anyway? Why push hard when you might not live to see the result? The fighting became
more careful, more planned, more sad. The plague years didn't end the siege, but they broke something in both armies. The feeling that victory was possible, the belief that giving everything mattered. After 1657, soldiers fought because they had no other choice, not because they expected to win, and the siege was barely halfway over. Another 12 years remained. 12 more years of slow death, fewer soldiers, and the question that nobody could answer. What were they even fighting for anymore? Venice couldn't hold Candia alone. By 1657, that much was clear. The plague had greatly hurt the soldiers. The treasury was losing huge amounts of money. The Ottoman army kept getting fresh troops from an empire with 30 million people. So Venice did what small powers always do when facing bigger ones, begged for help. The Venetian Senate sent messengers across Catholic Europe with a simple message. Candia is the last Christian fort standing between the Ottomans taking over and the Mediterranean. If it falls, Ottoman ships will rule these waters. Your trade routes will be threatened. Your coasts will be raided. This isn't just Venice's war. This is all of Christian Europe's war. Some of it was real worry about strategy. Most of it was just trying to convince others. But it worked. Kind of. Pope Innocent X was the first to respond. In 1650, he allowed an army to be sent. 12 big ships, 3,000 foot soldiers, a lot of money help. The Pope's flag, white and gold keys of St. Peter, sailed into Candia's harbour in July 1650 to cheers from the soldiers. The papal troops were professional, well-equipped, and very motivated. They fought at Martinengo next to Venetian forces and did very well in several battles. Morale in the city shot up. Fresh troops meant they could let tired units rest from the walls. The Ottomans faced defenders who were feeling new hope. Then, in January 1651, the papal commander received orders from Rome. Time to leave. The Vatican's money couldn't support the army any longer. 6 months. That's all they got. The papal troops left. The Venetians watched them sail away and realized this was the pattern they'd have to live with. Help would come, help would fight well, help would leave when the money ran out. It happened again in 1654. Pope Innocent X sent another army, smaller this time, maybe 1,800 troops. They stayed 4 months. It happened again in 1664, under Pope Alexander VII, 2,500 troops, 8 months of service. And again in 1667, 5,000 troops, the largest papal commitment yet. Each time the cycle repeated: arrival, hope, good fighting, then leaving when money ran out. The Vatican was spending huge amounts supporting Candia, but it was never steady. The troops came in waves, and the waves always went back. The one reliable source of help came from the least expected place, the Knights of Malta. The same knights whose raid on the Ottoman supply ships had started this entire war. You'd think Venice would be angry at them. Some Venetians were, but the knights kept showing up. They didn't send large armies. Malta was a small island with limited men, but they sent ships, fast, well-armed ships that got past the Ottoman blockade with supplies and volunteers. Over the 21-year siege, approximately 2,500 knights and Maltese soldiers served at Candia. Some stayed for months, others stayed for years. The knights had a special reputation in sea fighting. Ottoman sailors called them the Devil's Children because they'd attack Ottoman ships twice their size without hesitation. A single Maltese ship could break up a whole blockade formation just by being extremely brave and aggressive. In 1662, a Maltese group of just 5 ships stopped an Ottoman supply convoy of 15 ships heading to the siege camps. They shouldn't have attacked. They were outnumbered 3-1. They attacked anyway, sank 4 Ottoman ships, captured 3 more, and escaped with minimal losses. The supplies that didn't make it to the Ottoman camps bought the Venetians another month. But the knights couldn't win the siege alone. They were raiders and sea specialists, not fort builders or foot soldier leaders. They helped, but they couldn't break the tie. Other support came every now and then. German hired soldiers paid by Venice, expensive but effective. A few hundred French volunteers looking for glory. Spanish help that was more for show than practical. Various Italian states sending small groups. The problem was always the same. Nobody committed fully. Everyone helped, but only a little, only for a short time, only when it was easy for them. And the Venetians understood why. Europe's major powers had their own wars to fight. France was competing with Spain for power in Western Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was recovering from the 30 Years' War. Spain was fighting rebellions in Portugal and Catalonia. England was consumed by civil war and then political problems. Crete mattered, but it didn't matter enough. It was always someone else's less important task, never their main one. By the 1660s, the Venetian pleas became more urgent. Messengers stopped stressing strategy and started stressing survival. We're not asking you to win the war for us, we're asking you to help us not lose it. Then in 1669, France made its move. King Louis XIV had made sure his position was strong at home and wanted to show France as the main defender of Christianity against Islam. What better way than a dramatic intervention at Candia? He committed 6,000 troops and 30 ships, the largest single boost of the entire siege. Command went to the Duc de Beaufort, a French nobleman known for courage and aggression, and the Marquis de Saint-André-Montbrun, a seasoned officer. The fleet sailed from Toulon in May 1669 with excitement, public celebrations, and Louis XIV's clear approval. They arrived at Candia in June 1669. The soldiers welcomed them like saviors. 6,000 fresh troops nearly doubled Venetian fighting strength. The supplies they brought, gunpowder, food, medicine, were badly needed. This was the reinforcement Venice had been praying for. Beaufort immediately began planning aggressive actions, no waiting on defense. He wanted to hit the Ottoman siege lines hard, destroy their artillery positions, break up their trenches. Morosini was cautious. He had seen this pattern before, hope followed by disappointment, but he approved the operation. June 25, 1669, Beaufort led a major attack out of the city against Ottoman positions with 3,000 troops, a mix of French and Venetian. They launched before dawn, caught the Ottomans by surprise, and took over several artillery stations. They jammed guns, killed crews, destroyed ammunition stores. It was the most successful Venetian attack in years. Ottoman losses, approximately 2,200 dead, many guns destroyed. French losses,
400 dead, including the Duke de Beaufort. He was leading from the front, personally guiding the attack on an Ottoman station when a cannonball hit him, killing him instantly. His staff tried to get the body back, but had to retreat under heavy fire. The Ottomans kept it. The French group was shocked. Beaufort wasn't just their commander. He was a national figure, a symbol of French military pride, and he'd been killed on his first major operation at Candia. Saint-André-Montbrun took command, but the French officers immediately started arguing for leaving. This wasn't their war. They'd come to support Venice, not bleed for it. Beaufort's death proved that Candia was a death trap. Why should more French soldiers die here? Saint-André-Montbrun took them together for a few more weeks, but by August the situation was clear. The French were leaving. August 20th, 1669, the French army left Candia, all 30 ships, all remaining troops, about 4,500 survivors. They took their supplies with them, including ammunition the Venetians badly needed. Morosini reportedly confronted Saint-André-Montbrun on the docks. The exact words aren't written down, but Venetian reports say Morosini called it
the death of Christian honor. He accused the French of betrayal, of abandoning allies in their greatest need. Saint-André-Montbrun's response was cold. We came, we fought, we lost our commander. France does not owe Venice death for a cause. The French ships sailed away. Inside Candia, the remaining soldiers watched them go and understood. They were alone. All the pleas for Christian togetherness, all the talk of a common fight against Islam, all the promises from diplomats, they meant nothing when the fighting got hard. The pattern had been clear all along, but the French abandonment made it undeniable. Europe would send help, but only when easy, only when cheap, only when it didn't cost too much. Venice had been fighting for 21 years with the promise of support that kept arriving in pieces and leaving in waves. And now in August 1669, with the siege entering its final stage, they faced the Ottomans with whatever strength they had left, which wasn't much.
Because while Venice was begging Europe for help, the siege was doing something worse than killing soldiers. It was destroying the Republic's ability to pay for its own defense. Wars are won with money before they're won with guns, and Venice was running out of money. Here's what keeping Candia going actually cost. By 1660, the Venetian Senate was spending approximately 4 million ducats per year on Crete operations. That's just direct military expenses, troop salaries, supplies, ammunition, ship maintenance, fort repairs. To compare that, Venice's entire yearly government income in 1645 was about 3.5 million ducats. By 1660, that number had dropped to roughly 2 million because of trade problems and economic decline. They were spending twice their yearly income on a single siege. You can't keep that up. Nobody can. The Venetian treasury started taking emergency steps in the 1650s that became permanent desperation by the 1660s. First step, forced loans. The Senate required wealthy Venetian families to lend money to the state, essentially taking a percentage of their wealth with vague promises of repayment. In 1652, the wealthiest 200 families in Venice were told to give forced contributions totaling 800,000 ducats. Some paid willingly, seeing it as their duty to the country. Others fought back and faced having their property seized. The Grimani family, one of Venice's oldest noble houses, lost 3 large houses to state seizure when they couldn't meet their payment. Second step, selling positions and honours. Venice had always limited political jobs to people born into nobility. In 1646, they started selling noble status to wealthy merchants, pay 100,000 ducats, get admitted to the noble class, become eligible for Senate positions. Between 1646 and 1669, Venice sold noble titles to 127 families. It raised millions of ducats and destroyed hundreds of years of aristocratic exclusivity. The old families hated it. They called the new nobles ducat men, but the Senate didn't care. They needed the money. Third step, debt. Venice borrowed from anyone who would lend. Italian banks, German financiers, even Dutch merchants. By 1665, Venice's total war debt was over 40 million ducats. The interest payments alone consumed a quarter of the state budget.
lenders started demanding higher rates because everyone knew Venice was a bad investment. Some loans in the 1660s carried 12 to 15% interest, very high rates that showed how desperate Venice had become. All this money trouble had a direct practical effect on the siege. Here's how. Payments to hired soldiers got delayed. Professional soldiers fight for money. When the money stops coming, they stop fighting. In 1663, a German mercenary regiment stationed at Candia rebelled when their pay was 6 months overdue. They refused to guard the walls until they got paid. Morosini had to borrow from local merchants to settle the debt, and those merchants charged him 20% interest. Supply shipments became irregular. Every convoy to Candia cost money: crew salaries, ship supplies, cargo purchases. When Venice couldn't pay promptly, merchants stopped offering their ships. The Senate had to take control of vessels, which created anger among Venice's commercial class. A convoy scheduled for April 1664 got delayed until July because the Senate couldn't find enough ships. During those 3 months, Candia's garrison survived on reduced food. Soldiers got weak, disease spread faster, all because of cash flow problems in Venice. Quality of new recruits declined. In 1648, Venice could afford professional soldiers, trained troops with battle experience. By 1665, they were recruiting anyone willing to go. Prison inmates offered pardons in exchange for service, debtors giving debt forgiveness if they joined the army. Young men with no military experience handed a musket and shipped to Crete. These men weren't cowards, but they weren't soldiers either. They required training, supervision, and time to become effective. Morosini's officers had to constantly train new recruits while fighting a siege, which reduced overall combat effectiveness. Equipment standards dropped. Early in the siege, Venetian troops had good armor, good weapons, proper tools. By the 1660s, supply officers were buying cheap muskets that misfired, swords that broke, armor that couldn't stop Ottoman bullets. Soldiers complained, but there was no money for better. In 1667, a Venetian officer named Carlo Contrini wrote to the Senate, "You send us men without proper arms, and arms without proper men. We make do with what we have, but understand that we are not defending Candia with the quality you think. We defend it with determination alone, because our equipment is inadequate and our reinforcements are untrained." The Senate's response, if there was one, isn't recorded. They probably had nothing to say. They knew the situation. But here's the deeper problem. The siege wasn't just costing Venice money, it was destroying Venice's ability to make money. Venice was a trading republic. Its wealth came from controlling Mediterranean trade. Spices from the east, goods from Europe, shipping fees, port taxes. The entire way they made money depended on stable trade routes and commercial dominance. The war with the Ottomans disrupted all of that. Ottoman pirates raided Venetian merchant ships. Venice had to move naval resources from protecting trade to military operations. Merchants started avoiding Venetian-controlled waters because the risk was too high. Trade volume collapsed. In 1640, Venice's port handled roughly 6,000 merchant ship arrivals per year. By 1665, that number was under 3,000, half the commerce, half the revenue. Worse, competitors stepped in. Dutch and English merchants filled the gaps Venice left. They established their own trade routes with the East, cutting Venice out entirely. Amsterdam was becoming Europe's new main trading centre. Venice was becoming unimportant. The Senate understood this. They knew that even if they won in Crete, Venice's economic position might never recover. Some senators started arguing for talking peace, for cutting losses, for accepting that Crete wasn't worth permanent ruin. But others argued they'd already invested too much to quit. 21 years, tens of thousands of dead, millions of ducats spent. Withdraw now, and all of it was for nothing. Maybe they couldn't afford to keep fighting, but they also couldn't afford to have fought for nothing. So they kept going, borrowed more money, sold more titles, squeezed more taxes from a population that was increasingly restless. By 1668, ordinary Venetians were suffering. Bread prices had doubled since 1645. Unemployment was high because trade had declined. Young men kept getting forced into the army for a war nobody understood anymore. What did Crete matter to a dock worker in Venice? Why was his son dying on an island most Venetians had never seen? There were small riots in 1667, nothing organized, just spontaneous bursts of frustration. The Senate stopped them quietly, but the message was clear. Venice's population was done with this war. The Venetian leaders faced a choice: abandon Candia and face the political shame of surrender after 2 decades, or keep fighting and risk economic collapse and internal problems. They chose to keep fighting, not because victory was likely, but because admitting defeat was too hard to bear. And inside Candia, Francesco Morosini knew none of this political context mattered. He had walls to defend, soldiers to feed, and an Ottoman army that wasn't leaving. Whatever happened in Venice, his job stayed the same: hold until you can't. The question by 1669 wasn't whether Venice would abandon Candia. The question was whether the city would fall before Venice made that decision, because in June 1666, the Ottomans got a new supreme commander, and this one was different from all the others. This one knew how to win. Kurtpalu Fazıl Ahmed Pasha arrived at Candia in June 1666, and
The Venetians knew immediately this was different. He was 35 years old, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful position below the Sultan himself. He didn't need this assignment. He could have sent a subordinate, but Sultan Mehmed had personally asked him to finish the war his father had started 18 years earlier, and Köprülü took that seriously. He came with 40,000 fresh troops, 130 siege guns, and something the siege had never seen before: unlimited authority and unlimited resources. Previous commanders had to ask Constantinople for new soldiers. Köprülü was Constantinople. When he wanted something, it happened. The Venetian scouts watching his army arrive sent reports back to Morosini that read like shopping lists. Count the tents, count the artillery carts, count the supply wagons. The numbers were overwhelming. But what worried Morosini more than numbers was what happened next. Köprülü spent his first 2 weeks touring the siege lines, not inspecting from horseback like a formal visit, walking the trenches, talking to junior officers and common soldiers, looking at maps, asking questions. Where are the Venetian weak points? Which forts have the strongest defences? Which previous attacks came closest to succeeding, and why did they fail? He wasn't some noble playing at war. He'd been a soldier before becoming a politician. He understood moving supplies, engineering, and the tiring patience required for siege warfare. His first major decision: stop wasting men on attacks directly at the front. No more mass charges that got thousands killed for temporary gains. From now on, a systematic approach: mines, artillery, wearing them down. Grind them down until the walls collapse, then walk in. Second decision: reorganize the entire siege setup. Previous commanders had let the siege camps grow naturally over years. The result was chaos, poor cleanliness, inefficient supply lines, no standard command structure. Köprülü tore it all down and rebuilt it. New camps organized by unit, proper toilets dug, supply depots centralized, roads built for moving artillery, hospitals established for the wounded. He turned the Ottoman siege lines into a functioning military city. It took months, but once completed, the Ottoman army was operating at an efficiency level it hadn't seen since the siege began. Third decision: control the sea. The Venetian supply line through the harbour was the reason Candia had held for 18 years. Cut that and the city dies. Köprülü brought in the Ottoman navy. Not a blockade attempt like previous years, actual coordinated naval pressure. Ottoman ships patrolling constantly, shore batteries positioned to bother Venetian supply ships, fire ships compared to target vessels in the harbour itself. Venetian convoys that had been running supplies with moderate risk suddenly faced serious danger. Some ships made it through, many didn't. By late 1666, Candia's supply situation was becoming critical. Inside the city, Morosini watched these changes and understood what he was facing. This wasn't another rotating Ottoman commander who'd try for 6 months and give up. This was someone who'd stay until the city fell, someone with the resources, the authority, and the competence to see it through. Morosini called a council of his senior officers in August 1666. His message was blunt. Everything we've survived until now was preparation for what's coming. The previous commanders were testing us. This one will break us if we give him the opportunity. We hold because we have no other option. Köprülü launched his first major operation in October 1666. Not a dramatic assault, a methodical artillery campaign targeting the Sabaonara bastion, one of the outer defensive positions. 2 weeks of continuous bombardment, hundreds of cannonballs hitting the same sections of wall over and over until the stone started to crack. When the walls were sufficiently weakened, he ordered a mine exploded beneath the bastion's foundation. The explosion brought down an entire section. Ottoman infantry moved in immediately, not in chaotic waves but in organized units with clear objectives. The Venetians counterattacked. Fighting inside the breach lasted 11 hours. Both sides sent reinforcements into a confined killing zone. Eventually, the Venetians were pushed back. The Ottomans took Sabaonara. It was the first permanent Ottoman territorial gain inside Candia's outer defences since the siege began. Köprülü made the position strong. Instead of pushing further immediately, he fortified what he'd taken, built Ottoman defensive works on captured ground, positioned artillery to target the next bastion, then waited. This was different from previous Ottoman tactics. Earlier commanders would capture a position and immediately try to take advantage of it, stretching themselves too thin and getting pushed back. Köprülü took ground and made sure he kept it before moving to the next objective. The pace was slower, but it was working. By early 1667, the Ottomans held Sabaonara and were advancing on Martinengo, the same bastion that had been the main point of fighting for 18 years. The Ottomans had attacked it dozens of times, always failed. Now with Köprülü's systematic approach, they were getting closer. April 1667, Ottoman miners exploded a massive charge under Martinengo's outer wall. The explosion created a breach 50 meters wide. Köprülü sent in 5,000 troops with explicit orders: take the breach, hold it, don't stretch yourselves too thin. The assault lasted 2 days. The Venetians threw everything they had at stopping it. Counterattacks, artillery, grenades, desperate hand-to-hand fighting in the rubble. They killed over 2,000 Ottoman soldiers, but the Ottomans kept coming, fresh units replacing tired ones, and when the Venetians finally ran out of reserves, the Ottomans held the breach.
Martinengo, the bastion that had been the anchor of Candia's defense for nearly 2 decades, was damaged. Not fallen, but damaged. The Ottomans controlled part of it. They were inside the outer defensive web. Morosini pulled his forces back to the inner fortifications. There was no point defending Martinengo if holding it meant losing the entire garrison. He evacuated the remaining defenders at night and concentrated everything on the main city walls. It was the first major strategic withdrawal of the siege, and it meant Candia's defensive edge had just shrunk. By mid-1667, Venice's position was getting worse fast. Caprulu was taking ground. The supply line was increasingly dangerous. The garrison was down to maybe 3,500 effective fighters, and morale was breaking. Venetian soldiers had spent years believing they could hold. Now they were watching systematic Ottoman gains and realizing the walls wouldn't hold forever. Some started talking about surrender, not openly, suggesting surrender was technically treason, but in private conversations the question was there: how long can we actually last? Morosini heard the rumors. He addressed the garrison in August 1667 with a speech that survivors later recorded. He didn't promise victory. He didn't claim reinforcements were coming. He just said, "We hold until we can't. When that moment comes, we'll know. Until then, every day we hold is a day Venice lives. That's the job. Nothing more, nothing less." It wasn't inspiring. It was honest. And for men who'd been fighting for 19 years, honesty mattered more than inspiration. The siege entered 1668 with the outcome no longer in question. The Ottomans would take Candia. The only question was when and how many would die before it happened. Caprulu knew it. Morosini knew it. The soldiers on both sides knew it. But knowing the ending doesn't mean you stop fighting. Both sides kept going because that's what soldiers do. They complete the mission even when the mission is pointless. 1668 saw continued Ottoman advances. More breaches, more captured positions. The defensive perimeter kept shrinking. Venetian injuries
mounted. Supply ships came less frequently. The noose tightened. By early 1669, Candia had been reduced to the innermost fortifications. The outer bastions, Martinengo, Sabbionara, Jesus, were Ottoman-controlled. The main city walls were under constant bombardment. The harbor was barely functional. And then in May 1669, Louis XIV sent the French expedition. 6,000 troops, 30 ships, the last hope for a miracle. They fought for 3 months, lost their commander, then left. When the French sailed away in August 1669, everyone understood this was the end. Not the end of the fighting, that would take 1 more month, but the end of any realistic hope. The final phase had begun. August 22nd, 1669, 2 days after the French evacuated, Caprulu gave the order: final assault. No more methodical siegecraft, just overwhelming force until the walls break or the soldiers do. He'd watched the French ships sail away. He knew what that meant for Venetian morale. The moment to strike was now, while the defenders were still processing the abandonment. August 24th, Ottoman artillery opened up with the heaviest bombardment of the entire siege. Every gun Caprulu had, over 150 cannons, concentrated on a 300-meter section of the main wall between San Andrea and Pantocrator bastions. The barrage lasted 48 hours non-stop, day and night. Venetian defenders couldn't repair damage because the bombardment never paused long enough. Sections of wall that had stood for 21 years started to crumble. Inside Candia, the noise was unbearable. Constant thunder, building shaking, dust clouds so thick you couldn't see across streets, children screaming, ordinary people huddled in cellars praying the next cannonball wouldn't hit their building. Morosini had roughly 3,200 soldiers listed who could fight. That's what 21 years had reduced the garrison to. He positioned them at the threatened wall sections and waited for the assault he knew was coming. August 26th, the bombardment stopped. Silence. For the first time in 2 days, silence. Then the drums started. Ottoman war drums beating the advance. Tens of thousands of voices shouting war cries. The assault was coming. Venetian soldiers climbed to the walls and looked out at what they faced. Ottoman infantry formations as far as you could see. Janissaries in the front ranks, provincial troops behind them, irregulars in the rear. Wave after wave after wave. This wasn't a small attack. This was everything. The Ottomans advanced. Venetian artillery opened up, grapeshot tearing through the front ranks, men falling by the hundreds. But the formations kept coming, because there were so many that losses didn't matter. They reached the walls, planted ladders, started climbing. Venetian defenders fought them off, pushing ladders away, dropping grenades, firing down into the packed masses below. And the kill ratio was unbelievable. For every Venetian who died, maybe 10 or 15 Ottomans fell. But the math didn't favor the Venetians anymore. The assault lasted 6 hours. The Ottomans pulled back at nightfall. They'd failed to breach the walls, but they'd accomplished something more important.
They'd proven the Venetians couldn't stop them forever. Ottoman casualties, approximately 4,500 dead. Venetian casualties, 380 dead, over 600 wounded. Those Venetian losses were terrible, not because the numbers were high, they'd survived worse individual battles, but because there were no replacements. The 380 dead weren't getting replaced. The 600 wounded were out of action, and most wouldn't recover enough to fight again. Morosini now had fewer than 2,800 effective troops against an Ottoman army that had shown it could throw 4,500 men away and launch the same assault tomorrow. August 27th, Ottoman sappers detonated 3 major mines simultaneously under different sections of wall. The explosions created multiple breaches. Ottoman infantry poured in before the dust settled. The Venetians counterattacked. Brutal, close-quarters fighting in the breaches. No formations, no tactics, just men killing each other in confined spaces. The Venetians held, barely, but they held. August 28th, another assault, this time focusing on Pantocrator Bastion. The Ottomans broke through the outer wall and got into the bastion itself before Venetian reserves pushed them back out. It took everything the Venetians had, every reserve unit, every man who could hold a weapon. They threw cooks, clerks, wounded soldiers who could still walk, everyone into the breach, and they held again. But Morosini knew the numbers. Each assault, the Ottomans lost thousands. Each assault, the Venetians lost hundreds. The ratio was impossible to keep up. Eventually, soon, there wouldn't be enough defenders left to man the walls. August 29th, a messenger reached Morosini from a civilian group. The city's remaining population, maybe 12,000 civilians by this point, had selected representatives to ask for surrender. They weren't questioning his command. They were begging him to vend it before the Ottomans broke through and robbed the city, because that was the fear. If Candia fell by force, the soldiers would be killed and the civilian population enslaved. That was standard practice for cities taken by storm. Resist too long, lose the right to terms. But if they negotiated surrender while they still held the walls, they could bargain for safe passage. Morosini listened to the civilians. Then he called a council of his senior officers. He asked them directly, "Can we hold?" The room was silent. Finally, Captain Antonio Barbaro, the one-eyed veteran who'd been fighting since 1648, spoke. "We can hold for maybe another week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Then we'll have too few men to defend the walls and they'll break through. When that happens, everyone dies. Soldiers, civilians, everyone." Nobody disagreed with him, because everyone knew he was right. Morosini made the decision that night. He would negotiate surrender while Candia still had power, while they still held the walls before the final collapse. It was the hardest decision of his life. 21 years, tens of thousands dead, his entire adult life spent defending these walls, and now he had to surrender them. But the alternative was everyone being wiped out, so he chose surrender. August 30th, Morosini sent a representative to Coprolu under a flag of truce. The message was simple. Venice is prepared to negotiate terms for the surrender of Candia. Coprolu received the representative personally. His response was immediate. He would accept Venetian surrender under honorable terms. The soldiers would be allowed to leave with their weapons and personal hams. Civilians who wanted to leave could do so. Ships would be provided. No massacre, no enslavement. Why did Coprolu offer generous terms? Because he'd done the math too. He could take Candia by force. It would cost maybe another 10,000, 15,000 Ottoman lives and another month of fighting. Or he could accept surrender now, take the city whole, and save those lives for future campaigns. The negotiations took 5 days. Venetian and Ottoman representatives arguing over details. How many ships for evacuation? How much time for civilians to prepare? What about the fortifications? Would Venice destroy them or hand them over intact? The final terms signed September 5th, 1669. Venice would surrender Candia and all remaining parts of Crete to the Ottoman Empire. The Venetian soldiers would leave with full military honors. Flags flying, drums beating, weapons carried. Any civilian who wanted to leave would be allowed to evacuate within 12 days. The Ottomans would not interfere. Venetian ships would be permitted to enter the harbor to help with evacuation without being attacked. All prisoners of war on both sides would be exchanged. The fortifications would be handed over intact. When Morosini announced the terms to the soldiers, the reaction was mixed. Some soldiers wept. 21 years of fighting for nothing. Others felt relief. They
survived and could finally go home. Most felt nothing, just deep exhaustion. September 6th, the evacuation began. Venetian ships entered the harbour. Soldiers marched to the docks in formation, keeping discipline to the end. Civilians packed what they could carry and lined up for transport. The Ottomans watched from a distance, but didn't interfere. Coprolu had ordered strict discipline. Anyone who bothered the evacuees would be executed. He wanted this done cleanly. Over 12 days, approximately 10,000 people evacuated Candia. Soldiers, civilians, priests, merchants, anyone who wanted to leave. Some Cretans chose to stay under Ottoman rule. Most left for Venetian-controlled territories. Morosini was the last to leave. September 17, 1669. He walked through Candia's streets one final time, looking at walls he'd defended for 21 years. Then he boarded his ship and sailed away. The next day,
Ottoman troops marched through the gates unopposed. Koprolu toured the fortifications he'd spent 3 years trying to breach. He called them the finest defensive works he'd ever seen. The siege of Candia was over, the longest siege in history, 21 years, 2 months, and 24 days. And now came the final question. What did any of it mean? So, what did 21 years actually cost? Start with the Ottoman Empire. Careful guesses put their total dead at 108,000. That's soldiers killed in battle, died from disease, or lost to accidents and other causes over 21 years. Some historians argue the real number was closer to 130,000, but even the low estimate is staggering. To put that in perspective, the Ottomans lost more men taking one city than they lost in some entire wars. The conquest of Hungary in the 1540s, a massive campaign that lasted decades, cost fewer lives than the siege of Candia. And what did they get for it? Crete, an island they already controlled 90% of by 1648. They spent 21 years and 100,000 people's lives taking the last 10%. The financial cost was equally brutal. Ottoman treasury records show the Crete campaign cost approximately 50 million akçe per year at its peak over 21 years. That's over 1 billion akçe, roughly 16 to 18 million ducats in Venetian money. It didn't bankrupt the empire, but it strained resources that could have been used elsewhere. And strategically, Crete gave the Ottomans control of the central Mediterranean. Ottoman ships could now operate from Cretan ports, threatening Venetian and European trade routes more effectively. That mattered, but did it matter enough to justify the cost? Most Ottoman historians say no. Now Venice. Their casualties were lower in absolute numbers, but terrible compared to their size. Venetian military deaths, approximately 30,000 over 21 years. That includes soldiers, sailors, and mercenaries in Venetian service. For a republic with maybe 150,000 total citizens, that's 20% of the entire population. 1 in 5 Venetians either died in the war or had a family member who did. The financial disaster was worse. Venice spent an estimated 125 million ducats on the war. Their entire accumulated wealth, centuries of commercial dominance drained in 2 decades. The economic impact lasted generations. Venice never recovered its pre-war trading position. Dutch and English merchants had filled the empty space. By 1700, Venice was a second-tier power. By 1750, it was barely important. The siege didn't destroy Venice overnight, but it started the decline that ended with Napoleon getting rid of the Republic in 1797. What happened to the survivors tells you everything about what the war meant to the people who fought it. Francesco Morosini returned to Venice expecting shame. He'd surrendered the city. He'd lost Crete. He'd failed. Instead, Venice treated him as a hero. The Senate praised his defense as one of the greatest military achievements in Venetian history. He'd held for 21 years against impossible odds. The surrender wasn't failure, it was survival. He saved 10,000 lives that would have been lost if the city had fallen by storm. Morosini went on to command Venetian forces in later wars against the Ottomans. He's the one who successfully besieged Athens in 1687. Ironic, considering he became Doge of Venice in 1688 and died in office in 1694 while on campaign. He never stopped fighting. But the men who'd served under him, most disappeared from history. Antonio Barbaro, the one-eyed captain who'd fought from 1648 to 1669, returned to Venice and retired. There's one record of him asking the Senate for a pension in 1662. Whether he received it, nobody knows. He's never mentioned again. The soldiers who'd held the walls for years went home, if they had homes to go to. No parades, no pensions, no recognition beyond their immediate commanders. They'd done something extraordinary and got nothing for it. The civilian survivors scattered. Many Cretans who evacuated with the Venetians settled in Venetian-controlled islands, Corfu, Zakynthos, other Ionian territories. They built communities in exile, keeping Greek and Venetian cultural traditions. Some families didn't return to Crete for generations. Those who stayed in Candia under Ottoman rule adapted. The Ottomans weren't particularly harsh. Crete became another provincial territory. Christians paid extra taxes, but could practice their religion. Life continued, just under different control. On the Ottoman side, Koprolu Fazıl Ahmed Pasha got exactly what he expected: praise. Sultan Mehmed IV praised him publicly. The conquest of Crete was celebrated across the empire. Koprolu's reputation as the Grand Vizier who finished what others couldn't was secure. He died in 1676 during a campaign in Poland. 7 years after taking Candia, he was 45. Like Morosini, he never stopped campaigning. The janissaries and soldiers who'd fought at Candia dispersed to other wars. The Ottoman Empire was always fighting somewhere. Crete was just one assignment among many. Some veterans were sent to campaigns in Poland, others to Hungary, others back to Anatolia. There's no Ottoman accreditation to veterans' pensions. Soldiers who survived got paid for their service, then either stayed in the military or went home. The ones who stayed often died in the next campaign. The ones who went home disappeared into being unknown. Now the bigger question, did the siege matter strategically? Short term, yes. Ottoman control of Crete shifted the Mediterranean naval balance. Venice lost its forward base for stopping Ottoman shipping. Trade routes became more dangerous for Christian merchants. The psychological impact mattered too. The Ottomans had taken the fortress that everyone thought couldn't be beaten. If Candia could fall, anywhere could fall. Long term, not really. By the 1680s, the Ottoman Empire was spread too thin and starting to decline. They would lose major European territories in the next several decades. Crete was a small win in a big decline. They took the island right before their empire reached its peak and began shrinking. For Venice, the loss of Crete sped up a decline already happening. But Venice's real problem wasn't military, it was economic. The Mediterranean trade network that had made Venice wealthy was becoming old-fashioned. Atlantic trade was more important. Amsterdam, London, and eventually New York were the future. Venice was the past. The siege didn't cause Venice's decline, it showed it. Here's what's worth remembering. The siege of Candia was the longest siege in recorded history. 21 years. Nobody had fought for a single city that long before, and nobody has since. It killed roughly 140,000 people, possibly more. It bankrupted one empire and permanently weakened another. It deeply hurt generations of soldiers and civilians, and in the end the outcome was probably certain from day one. Could Venice have held longer? Probably not. Could they have negotiated better terms earlier? Maybe, but they didn't know the Ottomans would offer honourable surrender in 1669. For all they knew, fighting longer
might have improved their negotiating position. Could the Ottomans have won faster? Almost certainly, if they'd committed Coproli's civil resources in 1650 instead of 1666. Candia probably falls by 1655. But the empire had other priorities, and Crete was never the main effort. The siege happened because both sides couldn't afford to lose, so both kept fighting long after winning became impossible. If you've made it this far, you've just heard the story of one of history's most forgotten huge events, a 21-year war that killed more people than some countries had as population, a siege that outlived most of the soldiers who started it. The men who fought at Candia, Ottoman and Venetian, did something almost no one else in history has done. They sustained combat operations in the same place for over 2 decades. That takes a kind of staying power that's hard to even imagine. And at the end, what did they have to show for it? For the Ottomans, an island they'd mostly already conquered. For Venice, survival with dignity. For the soldiers on both sides, nothing but the knowledge that they'd held their ground until they couldn't anymore. Maybe that was enough. Maybe just surviving 21 years of that was its own kind of victory. But if you ask the men who fought there, the ones who watched friends die in trenches for decades, who crawled through collapsing tunnels, who held breaches while their commanders cycled through like seasonal appointments, they probably wouldn't call it victory. They'd call it what it was, the thing they survived. Drop a comment if you think this siege deserves more recognition in history. And if you made it this far, you're the real historian. Subscribe for more stories buried in history.